This video is on using narrative inquiry in qualitative research. So narrative inquiry is the study of the experience when it's understood and told as lived through stories. So that means that you're gathering people's stories of their experience, their explanation of what happened, both externally in the world around them and internally. How do they feel? How do they process? How do they understand that experience? There needs to be a collaboration between the researcher and the participants over time in a place or a series of places that will allow the participant to portray the full depth of their experience. And there's an important caveat there that there is a social interaction with the environment. So if you are doing an interview on, for instance, graduations and how people felt during their graduation, it most likely would be helpful to conduct one interview at the school from which they graduated and another interview at the place in which they graduated. So if, for instance, there was some kind of amphitheater or stage that they walked across, to be able to talk about that experience in that physical location can help elicit more comprehensive qualitative narrative data. The research purpose in narrative inquiry is to inquire as to people's lived and told stories. We're adding to our understanding about people's experiences, so we need as many details as people are capable of providing in order to try and pull out the major themes that are associated with that story. Narrative inquiry is structured by stories. It's structured by the individual's story of their experience, their retelling of that story, reliving that story, really digging deep into remembering that experience and converting that memory into something that can be shared with another person. This works well within three kind of dimensions of inquiry space: temporality, sociality, and place. So temporally, you want to make sure that you are addressing the correct time frame. It's not terribly helpful to have a narrative inquiry approach to someone's very early childhood experiences because they're probably jumbled. The temporality doesn't make sense because most of us, when we remember back to when we were very young children, we have major memories that stand out, but we may not have them in a temporal sequence or in the sequence in which they actually happened. We just have the most impactful memories. Similarly, the sociality space needs to be accounted for. If you are getting stories about people's experience, again, for instance, graduation, you need to know who was present and who was not present, who really valued that experience and had a lot of friends who were graduating at the same time, and someone else who maybe had several siblings go through school before them. They'd been to graduations beforehand, and so that socially learned aspect meant that this graduation was really not that special for them. On the other hand, it could have been very special for them because it was the only time they were the ones in focus and who got to walk across the stage or receive that diploma. And then finally, we need to be thinking about place. And that can refer both to temporal place and physical place. So what is the physical space the story operates within, and is that still something that is present? So if you were gathering stories about someone's schooling and that school no longer exists, it's impossible to revisit that place. So you have to kind of reconceptualize and reassess how you're going to locate the story within the place, both as it is now and as it used to be. There can be multiple starting points in narrative inquiry. You can start by asking participants to tell the story of their experience, and then you can come alongside the participants as they live out their lives. And that can either be in a structured manner, in an intentional, here's what we're going to do today. I want you to tell me, about your experience as we walk through an area that is related to that experience. Or it can be just as they're going about their daily life, and having them recall stories just kind of as they are remembered. And there are several kinds of justification that narrative inquiry can attend to. There's personal justification, where an individual is relaying their story and justifying that experience from their own internal perspective. So, what they were feeling, what they were seeing, how they were interpreting the world around them, it's all what was going on within their minds. There's also the practical justification. So that can be more what stories can you get, what stories can't you get, how much does that mesh with either other stories of the same phenomenon or the same experience, or with other records of that experience. So, for instance, if someone said, "Oh yeah, we were stuck inside for 6 months," and someone else says, "No, we weren't. Here's pictures of us all out doing things," then it tells you, okay, there's a practical issue with the justification of this experience. We need to dig a little deeper and understand why that person is reporting what they are reporting. There's also social and or theoretical justification, and this often involves not only putting someone's narrative in concert with the other um, stories and other fact checking mechanisms, but also with literature and with theoretical perspectives. So, putting, for instance, someone's story about graduating at an inner city high school in, say, Detroit, and other theoretical perspectives on, for instance, critical race theory or theories of marginalization to understand what that meant for the individual and kind of give that broader theoretical interpretation of one person's experience. Narrative inquiry focuses more on puzzles rather than research questions. You're trying to pull out and deconstruct someone's lived experience. You're not really interested as much in the research questions that the study may be overall trying to understand. If that sounds odd, remember that narrative inquiry is typically a component of a larger qualitative study. So while you may be gathering these stories, you won't be bringing in the theoretical perspective or the research questions as much until you're starting to analyze the data that was gathered from these experiences or from these stories. When conducting a narrative inquiry, there's this idea of entering into the midst. You are um, the life of you and those you are studying should be going on at the same time, and you should be experiencing it with the person that you are interviewing. You need to attend to the past, the present, and the future. So not only what is the story about, but how are they reconceptualizing that story during the retelling? How are they? How does that story tell them and tell you about that individual's future or future goals or ambitions or plans? It's also important to attend to the place where that participant is. As mentioned before, it can often be helpful to conduct these kinds of qualitative narrative inquiries in a place that is related to the experience. It can help kind of jog people's memories. It can help them elaborate more and let you get data that otherwise may have been glossed over or may have just been forgotten. And it can be very helpful to have um, a conception or conceptualization of the relationships that were important with this story. Perhaps it's attending to old, new relationships, people that they've met before, the story that they are retelling, people that were involved in the story that they are retelling, and sometimes even those other individuals' narratives may play into the narrative inquiry. So you may be focused on one individual, but understanding, for instance, someone's experience with opioid addiction may be further contextualized by also having their family in at least some of the interviews and telling the family telling their experience and their perspective on this individual's struggles with opioid addiction. It can again put that story into context and concert with other stories and give that deeper meaning. When doing narrative inquiry, you do need to think about when and how often you will meet with your participant. If you only have an hour once every 6 months, you're going to get a very different amount of data and a different quality of data than if you're meeting with them for 30 minutes every 2 weeks. You also do need to think about who will be present, and that's again back to that relationship and social context of the narration. You also need to think about what personal items will be shared. For instance, when I was doing qualitative data collection and analysis, the kind of mid-level qual class in the RMS department, one of the things I did when interviewing my Japanese American partner's mother-in-law, sort of, but when I was interviewing her about her experiences in Japan and in the United States, she brought out many of the items she brought with her from Japan. Her family was upper class in Japan, and she moved to the U.S. She married a low-level Marine, and so they were quite poor. So she brought out a lot of the items, family heirlooms that she brought with her, as well as some of the contrasting items that she obtained in the United States. You also have to think about what stories are going to be included and what pseudonyms will be used. Some people feel very strongly that they want to share their story and they would like to be identified in that sharing and in that retelling. They kind of take ownership of the experience and are very adamant that they want their name associated with anything that comes out. On the flip side, you have individuals who are very hesitant at putting their name to their experience. They may not be hesitant to share the experience, but they may not want their name associated with it. It may have repercussions on their future, on their current relationships, those kinds of things. And so many times, one of the kind of ethical guidelines is to use pseudonyms, to use fake names for individuals. That can be kind of waived with participant um, desires, or pseudonyms can be perhaps more or less obscure. But generally speaking, it's best practice to use a pseudonym, particularly in any kind of publication, because we don't want these narratives that are shared to come back and kind of haunt the participant. You also need to determine what will you do once the research is done. Once you have collected all of your data and analyzed it, which is arguably the more intense component of this kind of research. Once all that's done, you need to think about how will you meet with the participant after? How will you start not only sharing what you found, but making sure, member checking with the individual to make sure that your interpretation and what you pulled out of that narrative isn't completely out of left field. It isn't something completely different than they intended or than their recollection of the experience. So in narrative inquiry studies, we work to create field texts. And when we say the field in narrative inquiry, it's not the same as when we say the field in something like my experience with primatology. The field really means wherever you are conducting your interview and wherever you are gathering the data. So the field is that kind of inquiry space, the space that's between the researcher and the participant. It can be virtual, it can be physical, it can be cognitive, but you are using that space to kind of contextualize your own understanding. So you want to include things in your field texts that are not just the notes from the interview, but also the transcripts of the interview, which generally are done after the fact. You normally will record the interview and then write up the transcript. You'll want to include artifacts or photos, plans, policies, procedures, any documentation that's related to the narrative which the participant would like to share or is comfortable sharing. The primary method of data collection generally is multiple conversations, somewhere between 3 to 5, and inquiry into any kind of artifact or document that the participant shares. So that's a brief overview of narrative inquiry in qualitative data. As always, please just let me know if you have any questions.